You know, I never thought it would end like this, Janet whispered under her breath as she stared at the empty chairs around the dinner table. It was supposed to be a celebration. Her 65th birthday, a milestone, a day for her family to come together. Instead, she sat alone in the large dining room, the soft glow of the candlelight flickering against the fine china she had carefully set just a few hours earlier. She had made all the right preparations, decorated the house, bought the gifts, even baked her famous carrot cake, just like she used to do every year when the family gathered. But today, it felt different. The absence of her children, of her son, Michael, and his wife, Danielle, echoed louder than any laughter ever could. She glanced at the clock on the wall. The party was supposed to start hours ago, but no one had shown up. No phone calls, no messages. Just the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of cars passing outside. Her heart sank as she realized the truth. Her family had forgotten about her. Or worse, they didn't care. She had been the one who had always kept the family close, always making sure to remember every birthday, every anniversary, every small detail that made them feel loved. And yet here she was, waiting, alone. She picked up her phone and dialed Michael's number again. The call went straight to voicemail. "Where are you, Michael?" she thought, but she already knew. The signs had been there for a while. She had seen the subtle changes, the missed visits, the excuses, the way Danielle's tone had shifted over the past few months. It was as if they were slowly pushing her out of their lives. The doorbell suddenly rang, pulling her from her thoughts. Janet stood up quickly, her heart skipping a beat. Maybe they had just been running late. Maybe something had come up. She walked toward the door, a faint smile creeping onto her face, hopeful. But when she opened it, standing there was Michael, his face tight with discomfort, his wife, Danielle, standing behind him with an awkward smile. Neither of them seemed particularly happy to be there. "Happy birthday, Mom," Michael said, his voice flat. Janet stood frozen for a moment, searching his face for any sign of warmth, any hint of love. But there was nothing. She forced a smile, stepping aside to let them in. "Thank you," she said, her voice betraying the hurt she was trying to hide. As they walked past her, Janet couldn't help but notice the way they both avoided making eye contact with her. She led them to the dining room, where the table was set, the candles burning low. There was a strange tension in the air, an unspoken distance between them. Michael sat down at the head of the table, while Danielle took a seat across from him. It felt like an interview rather than a celebration. "We've been meaning to talk to you, Mom," Michael said after a long pause, his eyes shifting to Danielle. Janet's heart skipped again. "About what?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Well," Danielle said, breaking the silence with her usual cold tone, "it's just that we've been thinking. The house is too big for you now, and we think it might be time for you to move to a senior living community." Janet's blood ran cold. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It wasn't the first time the suggestion had come up, but hearing it so bluntly, at her own birthday dinner, felt like a slap in the face. She stared at her son, her own flesh and blood, and felt the weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest. "I've been managing just fine," she said softly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain calm. Michael and Danielle exchanged a look, one that spoke volumes. "You're just getting older, Mom," Michael said, his tone dismissive. "You can't keep up with everything here anymore. It's too much for you." Janet's hands gripped the edge of the table as she fought to keep her composure. "This is my home," she said quietly. "Your father and I built it together. I'm not going anywhere." But Michael just shook his head. "We've already made arrangements," he said, his voice hardening. "It's for your own good, Mom. You'll see." Janet felt her world shatter in that moment. It wasn't just the house they wanted. It was everything she had ever worked for, everything she had sacrificed for her family, all thrown aside as if it meant nothing. She took a deep breath, fighting back tears, and stood up from the table. "I need some air," she muttered, leaving the room without looking back. As she stepped out onto the porch, the cool evening breeze hit her face, and for the first time in a long while, Janet allowed herself to feel the full weight of the hurt she had been carrying. How could her son, the one she had loved and raised, do this to her? How could her family be so cold, so indifferent? She had given them everything, and this was how they repaid her? Janet didn't know what to do next, but she knew one thing for sure. This was the last time they would take her for granted. Janet stood outside on the porch, the cold night air biting at her skin. The weight of the words Michael had said at dinner still lingered in her chest, pressing down harder than the chill of the evening. She could feel the tears threatening to break free, but she refused to let them fall. Not now. Not when she needed to hold on to whatever dignity she had left. The moonlight reflected off the driveway, casting a pale glow over the empty yard. Janet could hear the sound of distant traffic, but it seemed so far away, as if she were in a different world. A world where families didn't turn on each other. A world where a mother wasn't cast aside like yesterday's trash. She leaned against the porch railing, her mind spinning. The house felt different now, as though it had grown too big, too silent. She had spent so many years filling it with laughter, with love, and now it felt hollow. Janet's thoughts turned to her late husband, John. He had always been the strong one, the protector, the one who made sure the family stuck together. Janet had always supported him, always stood by his side, raising their children with love and care. They had worked so hard for everything they had, this house included. It had been their dream to create a home where their children could grow up safe and loved. Janet could still remember the days when Michael and his sister, Amy, would run through the house, laughing, fighting over the last piece of candy, playing games in the living room. Those were the days when she and John had felt like a family. But now, it seemed like that was all in the past. Janet closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the times when the house was filled with warmth and joy. Now it was just her and the empty spaces that once held memories. She let out a sigh and wiped away a tear that had escaped. She knew she couldn't go on like this. She couldn't keep pretending everything was okay when her own son had humiliated her. Janet had been the one to always put the family first, to sacrifice her own happiness for their well-being. And this was how they repaid her? By telling her she was too old to live on her own? By shoving her aside like she didn't matter? No, Janet wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let Michael and Danielle think they could control her, manipulate her into leaving her home. She had spent too many years building this life to just give it up. The next morning, Janet woke up early, her mind already made up. She couldn't let Michael and Danielle win. She had to stand up for herself, for the woman she used to be, the woman who had fought for her family, for her happiness. Janet went to the kitchen and began preparing breakfast. She moved with purpose, as if the act of cooking could somehow put the pieces of her broken heart back together. The house was quiet, but the silence felt different now. It was no longer the peaceful quiet of a family at rest, but the heavy quiet of a family on the brink of collapse. Janet set the table for one, as she had been doing for the past few months. There was no one else to share the meal with, no one else to sit across from her. Just her and the empty chair. As she ate, she thought about her options. She could leave, go to one of those senior communities Michael had suggested, but that wasn't what she wanted. She had worked hard her entire life. She had earned the right to live in the home she and John had built together. She didn't want to be treated like a burden, like something to be discarded. Janet's thoughts turned back to Michael. How could he do this to her? How could he turn his back on her so easily? She had given him everything, and now he was taking it all away. She had always known that Michael was ambitious, but she never thought he would be this cold, this heartless. Janet finished her breakfast and stood up, her resolve hardening. She wasn't going to let Michael and Danielle get away with this. She would fight for her home, for her dignity, for the life she had built. She was going to make sure they understood that she was not someone to be discarded. She wasn't just an old woman who had nothing left to give. She was Janet, a woman who had given everything for her family, and she wasn't going to let them take that away from her. The day ahead felt heavy, but Janet was ready. Ready to confront Michael. Ready to take back what was rightfully hers. Janet didn't wait long before calling Michael. Her hands were steady as she dialed his number, the familiar ringing filling the silence in the room. She had made up her mind. Today was the day she would confront him. She needed answers, and she needed him to understand that she wasn't going to be pushed around anymore. The phone rang 3 times before Michael's voice came on the line. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone distant. Janet could hear the background noise of a busy office or perhaps a coffee shop, but there was no warmth in his voice. "Michael," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger building inside her. "We need to talk." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Janet could feel him hesitate, perhaps expecting her to ask about something trivial or small. But she wasn't going to let him off that easily. About what happened last night, she continued. About what you said at dinner. Mom, I don't think there's anything to talk about, Michael replied, his voice sounding as if he was trying to avoid a confrontation. Janet took a deep breath. I think there's plenty to talk about, she said, her voice firm now, no longer hiding the hurt she felt. You humiliated me in front of everyone, Michael. You made me feel worthless. Michael sighed on the other end, and Janet could almost hear him rolling his eyes. Mom, it wasn't meant to be a big deal. It was just a joke. You need to lighten up. A joke? Janet's voice rose slightly, but she quickly regained her composure. Is that how you think I should feel, Michael? As though my years of raising you, of giving everything I had to this family, should be laughed off as a joke. There was silence on the other end of the phone. Janet could hear him breathing, but he didn't respond immediately. She could feel the weight of the conversation pushing against her, but she wasn't going to let him dodge the truth. I'm not some punchline, Michael, she said, her voice cold now. I don't deserve to be treated like this. Not by you. Not by anyone. Mom, look, Michael's voice was softer now, but there was still that underlying impatience. I don't have time for this. I've got a lot going on. Danielle and I have been discussing what's best for you. This isn't about hurting you. It's about what's best. What's best? Janet's voice was sharp now. What's best is that I get treated with respect. That's what's best. She paused for a moment, trying to steady herself before continuing. I built this home with your father. I spent my whole life making sure you were taken care of. And this is how you repay me. Mom, it's not about the house, Michael said, his voice tight. It's about you being alone. You can't keep up with everything. You're just getting older, and it's hard for you to handle. We're just trying to help. I don't need your help. Janet snapped, her heart racing. I need you to stop treating me like I'm some burden. I need you to stop pretending like you know what's best for me when you haven't even asked how I feel. She paused again, feeling the sting of his words from last night all over again. I'm not going anywhere, Michael. This is my home. I earned it. Your father and I built this life together, and I'm not going to let you tear it down because it's inconvenient for you. Michael's voice softened, but there was still a hint of frustration in it. Mom, you're not seeing the bigger picture here, he said. Danielle and I have already looked into some great places for you. It's time you thought about your future. We're just trying to make things easier for you. You don't get it, do you? Janet said, her voice trembling now with emotion. This isn't about making things easier for me. It's about you getting rid of me because I'm in the way. You don't want to deal with the responsibility of taking care of your own mother, so you make up excuses about my future. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Janet could feel the weight of his silence pressing in on her. Finally, Michael spoke again, his voice quieter now. I'm just trying to do what's right. Janet could hear the guilt in his voice, but it wasn't enough. It didn't change what he had said, what he had done. What's right? Janet repeated, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. What's right is respecting me, Michael. What's right is acknowledging everything I've done for this family, everything I've sacrificed. You don't get to decide what's best for me without even asking me what I want. Another silence hung between them. Janet's mind raced, her thoughts tumbling over each other. She didn't know what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let them push her out of her own life. You need to come home, Michael, Janet said finally, her voice steady again. We need to have a real conversation. Not just a phone call, not just some empty words. I'm not going to let this go. She could feel the finality in her words, the weight of the decision that had been made. This was no longer about her birthday, about what had happened at dinner. It was about her future, her life, and her family. And she wasn't going to let them take that away from her. Janet sat in the kitchen the next morning, the silence of the house surrounding her like a heavy fog. The phone call with Michael had left her feeling drained, but more than that, it had given her something she hadn't realized she needed, clarity. She no longer felt like the victim, the one who had been wronged and cast aside. She felt a fire within her now, a determination that hadn't been there before. Her fingers gently traced the rim of her coffee mug, the warmth of the ceramic soothing against her skin. The house, once filled with the sounds of her children's laughter and the bustle of family dinners, now felt like a hollow shell. Janet had built this life, and she wasn't about to let it crumble just because Michael and Danielle didn't understand the value of what they had. As she took another sip of her coffee, she thought about the years she had spent raising Michael, the sacrifices she had made to ensure he and his sister had everything they needed. She had worked tirelessly, putting their needs before her own, and now here she was, being pushed out of the home she had shared with her late husband, the man she had built a life with. She set the mug down and stood up, her resolve hardening with each passing moment. She wasn't going to just sit back and let them take everything from her. Not without a fight. Janet walked to the living room and stood by the window, staring out at the garden. It was early spring, and the flowers her husband had planted were beginning to bloom again. They had spent years together in this house, planting those flowers, tending to the garden. It was one of the few things they had shared that truly made the house feel like home. Janet let out a long breath, her heart heavy with the weight of the situation. She had always prided herself on being strong, on being the one who held the family together, but now it felt as if everything she had worked for was slipping away. She walked over to the family photo album that sat on the coffee table, its worn cover a reminder of the memories that once filled these walls. Flipping through the pages, Janet stopped at a picture of Michael and his sister, Amy, taken during their childhood. They were so full of life back then, so full of love. Janet's heart tightened as she gazed at the photo. What had happened to that love? How had it turned into the cold indifference she felt now? Her fingers traced the image of Michael's smiling face, and for a moment, she felt the sting of regret. She had given him everything, everything, and now, he was treating her like she was nothing more than an inconvenience. I won't let them win, she muttered to herself. She was done playing the part of the victim. Janet had spent too many years being the one who sacrificed, the one who gave, the one who bent to the will of others. It was time for her to take control, to stand up for herself. She wasn't going to sit in silence any longer, waiting for them to decide her fate. Janet picked up the phone once more, this time dialing Amy's number. Her sister, the one person who had always understood her, the one person who hadn't forgotten her. The phone rang twice before Amy picked up. "Hey, Janet," Amy said, her voice warm and familiar. "What's going on?" Janet took a deep breath. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. "I'm not going to let Michael and Danielle push me out of this house. I'm going to fight for it. For us." Amy was silent for a moment, and Janet could almost hear her processing the words. "What do you mean, fight for it?" Amy asked. "You don't have to do this alone. You know that, right?" Janet's grip on the phone tightened. "I know, but this is my fight now. I'm not going to let them treat me like this anymore. I've spent my whole life giving, and it's time for me to take back what's mine." "You're right," Amy said after a pause. "You've earned that. We'll figure this out together." Janet smiled, the first genuine smile she had in days. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she had someone in her corner. And that made all the difference. "Thank you, Amy," Janet said softly. "Thank you for believing in me." The conversation ended, and Janet placed the phone down on the counter. She stood there for a moment, staring out at the garden, the bright colors of the flowers now more vibrant than ever. It was as if the world was telling her she still had time. Time to make things right. Time to take back what was hers. Janet turned away from the window, her steps purposeful as she walked toward the door. She was done waiting, done being the silent observer in her own life. It was time to take control. Janet knew there would be battles ahead, but she was ready. She wasn't going to let anyone strip her of her dignity. Not her son, not anyone. She had spent her life building a family, and she wasn't going to let them tear it apart without a fight. Janet sat at the kitchen table, her hands clenched around the edge, the cool surface of the table grounding her. The sun streamed in through the window, casting a soft glow over the room, but the warmth it offered couldn't ease the cold knot that had settled in her chest. The conversation with Michael earlier had left her reeling, but it also gave her something she hadn't had in a long time: clarity. She wasn't going to sit idly by and let him, or anyone, dictate her life. For the first time in weeks, she felt in control of her own future. Janet glanced at the clock. It was nearly noon, but the house felt like it had stood still for hours. The emptiness around her seemed to echo, reminding her of how alone she truly felt. Yet, she knew she wasn't completely alone. Amy had called her back just a few minutes ago, offering her support. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind Janet that she wasn't entirely forgotten. As the phone call had ended, Janet's heart had lifted just a bit, and the heaviness that had settled on her shoulders seemed a little lighter. The warmth from the coffee in front of her seeped into her hands as she picked it up and took a sip. The bitter taste of it was a stark contrast to the sweetness of the memories she had been holding on to for so long. She put the mug down and wiped her hand on her jeans, standing up and walking over to the window. The garden was still quiet, but the sight of it, the flowers that had been there for years, the greenery that seemed to hold on even when everything else around her had changed, gave her a sense of peace. Janet knew she wasn't ready to give up on her life, on the home she had built, on the love she had once shared with her late husband. She wasn't ready to let her son and daughter-in-law destroy everything she had worked for, just because they thought she was a burden. The thought of moving to a senior community, of giving up her home, made her stomach turn. It wasn't just about the house. It was about dignity, about respect, something that she felt had been stripped away piece by piece over the past few months. As she gazed out the window, she thought about her husband, John. He would never have stood by and let this happen. He would have fought for her, for their family. And Janet realized, with a sudden clarity, that she needed to do the same. She needed to fight. She wasn't just fighting for her house. She was fighting for herself, for her right to be seen, to be heard. It was time to stop hiding behind polite words, behind the facade of the loving mother who always put others first. Janet had spent her life making sure everyone else was taken care of, but now it was time for her to take care of herself. She walked over to the phone and picked it up, dialing the number for the lawyer she had used when John passed away. It was time to get some answers. When the receptionist answered, Janet's voice was firm, even though her hands trembled slightly. "Hello, this is Janet Thompson. I need to schedule an appointment with Mr. Foster. It's urgent." The receptionist assured her that Mr. Foster would get back to her as soon as possible, and Janet hung up, feeling the first stirrings of hope since the night before. She wasn't going to let Michael and Danielle control her anymore. She wasn't going to let them push her out of the home that had been a symbol of her love, her hard work, and her devotion to her family. The phone call to the lawyer was just the beginning. Janet knew there was much more to do. She would fight for her rights, for the life she had built, and for the dignity that was rightfully hers. As the hours passed, Janet found herself making a list. A list of things she needed to do, things she needed to say, people she needed to contact. The list felt empowering. It gave her something to focus on, something to take her mind off the betrayal she felt, even though it lingered in the back of her mind like a dark cloud. Janet thought about the times she had seen other women in her community, women her age, who had been pushed aside by their families, who had been told that they were no longer needed. Janet refused to let that be her fate. She refused to let them see her as weak, as someone to be discarded. She wasn't finished. She wasn't done. Janet walked back to the window, the weight of the situation settling over her once again. But this time, it didn't feel like defeat. It felt like the beginning of something new. She would stand up for herself, for the woman she had been, and for the woman she still was. She wasn't going to be pushed out of her own life. She wasn't going to be silenced. And she wasn't going to let anyone take her dignity away. Not again. Janet had made up her mind. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. Janet woke up the next morning to a crisp, quiet day. The sun had barely risen, casting soft light through the window, but it didn't feel like the beginning of anything new. For a moment, she wondered if she had the strength to go through with it all. Michael's cold dismissal the night before still echoed in her mind. "It's just a joke," he had said. But Janet knew better. She wasn't going to let that be the end of her story, no matter how hard it seemed. She stood up from the bed, taking a deep breath, and walked over to the window. The world outside looked so peaceful, almost mocking in its serenity, while she was about to face a battle for her own life. She had never imagined that she would be fighting for her dignity in her own home, not at this stage in life. Yet here she was. Janet had always been the quiet, steady one in the family, the one who kept everything running smoothly. But now, she realized she had spent too many years living in the background, putting everyone else first. Her children, her husband, her friends, they all came before her, and now it was time to make her own needs known. She had already made the decision to fight for her place in the family, for the life she had built. She wasn't just going to fade into the background without a word. She picked up her phone and dialed the lawyer she had spoken to earlier. This time, her fingers were steady. She knew exactly what she needed to do. The phone rang once, twice, and then the familiar voice of Mr. Foster answered. "Janet, good to hear from you," he said, his tone calm, professional. How can I help you today? Janet took a breath. I need to make sure that my rights are protected. I don't care what Michael or Danielle say. I want to make sure I can stay in my home. I want to take action. There was a brief pause on the other end, and she could feel Mr. Foster's attention sharpen. I understand. We can begin the process of reviewing your legal options. You've got every right to fight for your property, for your peace of mind. Let's schedule a meeting to go over everything. Janet's heart beat a little faster. The relief of having a plan, of knowing she was no longer alone in this, settled over her like a warm blanket. Thank you, she said, her voice quieter now. I want to do whatever it takes. Of course, Mr. Foster replied. We'll make sure your interests are protected. I'll have my office reach out to you to set up a time. As she hung up the phone, Janet felt a renewed sense of purpose. For the first time in weeks, her mind wasn't clouded by the confusion of betrayal or the crushing weight of isolation. She had a goal now, something concrete to work toward. She wasn't going to let her family tear her apart. She was going to fight for what she had built, for the life she had given everything to. Janet looked at the clock on the wall. It was early still, but she was already moving with a sense of urgency she hadn't felt in years. She walked to the kitchen and began to prepare her usual breakfast. A simple meal of eggs and toast, but this time, she made it with a focus, a determination that surprised even her. The small, quiet act of cooking felt like a reclaiming of her life, a small victory in the face of everything that had happened. As she sat down to eat, Janet allowed herself a brief moment of quiet reflection. The house felt the same as it always had. The creak of the old floors, the smell of her morning coffee filling the air, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the background. This was her home, and no one was going to take it away from her. Janet knew there were more challenges ahead. There would be meetings, documents to sign, legal battles to fight. But for now, in this moment, she had something that no one could take from her: control. She was the one in charge of her own life again. She wasn't going to let Michael or Danielle dictate her future. Her thoughts shifted back to the phone call with Michael. His words, his dismissive tone, still stung. But Janet had learned something important from that conversation. She had learned that she could no longer be passive. She couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine while they made decisions about her life without even consulting her. No more. Janet took a deep breath and stood up from the table. She wasn't going to just be the person who picked up the pieces anymore. She was going to make her own path, one step at a time. She moved through the house with a newfound sense of strength, each step firm and deliberate. She had spent so long being the one who held everything together, but now it was her turn to rebuild. She would no longer be the silent one. She would no longer be ignored. Janet had spent years making sacrifices, but now, it was time for her to stand up for herself. She knew it wasn't going to be easy, and there would be times when she would feel doubt. But the resolve she felt now was stronger than ever. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't backing down. As she walked into the living room, Janet looked around one last time, her gaze sweeping over the familiar furniture, the pictures on the walls, the warmth of the space that had once been filled with family. This was her life, and she was going to fight for it. She wasn't going to be pushed out of the life she had built. Not now. Not ever. Janet stood in front of the mirror, her reflection staring back at her. The woman she saw was different from the one she had been just a few months ago. Gone was the passive, quiet woman who had accepted the pain and disappointment of her family. In her place was someone stronger, more determined. The lines on her face, the gray in her hair, didn't define her anymore. It was her eyes that told the story. Now, eyes that reflected years of love, sacrifice, but also a newfound strength. She wasn't going to let them take her home from her. She wasn't going to let Michael and Danielle make decisions for her any longer. As she turned away from the mirror, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in a long time. She had a plan now. Janet picked up her phone and dialed the number for her lawyer, Mr. Foster. The phone rang twice before he answered. "Good morning, Janet," he said. "How are you today?" Janet's voice was steady as she replied, "I'm ready to move forward. Let's make sure I have everything in place to fight for my home." There was a brief pause, and then Mr. Foster's voice softened. "I'm glad to hear that. We'll take it step by step. I've already started working on your case. We'll make sure you're legally protected, Janet." Janet felt a wave of relief wash over her. The fight ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, She felt like she had control over her own life. "Thank you, Mr. Foster," she said, her voice steady. "I won't back down." After hanging up, Janet took a deep breath and walked to the kitchen. The familiar smell of coffee filled the air as she started preparing breakfast. The rhythmic sound of the knife chopping vegetables calmed her, grounding her in the present moment. As the eggs sizzled in the pan, she thought about the conversations she had had with Michael over the years. How had it come to this? How had her son become so distant, so indifferent to her needs? It was hard to understand, but Janet knew now that she couldn't keep waiting for him to come around. She had to take action. As she sat down to eat, the phone rang again. It was Amy. Janet smiled, feeling a sense of comfort knowing her sister was still there for her. "Hi, Janet." Amy's voice came through the phone. "How are you holding up?" Janet sighed. "I'm doing okay. I've made up my mind, Amy. I'm going to fight for my home. I'm not going to let Michael and Danielle push me out." Amy's voice softened. "I'm proud of you, Janet. You deserve to be heard. You've always been there for everyone else. Now it's time for you to stand up for yourself." Janet could feel the warmth in her sister's words. It was a reminder that she wasn't alone in this. "Thank you, Amy. I just need to make sure I do this right. I can't let them just take everything from me." There was a moment of silence on the phone before Amy spoke again. "You've always been strong, Janet. Don't forget that. You've got this." The encouragement from her sister fueled Janet's resolve. She wasn't going to let her son or anyone else decide what her life would look like. She had worked too hard for too long to let it slip away. Janet finished her breakfast and stood up, feeling a sense of purpose settle in her chest. The house was quiet, but the silence no longer felt oppressive. It felt like a space where she could take control of her future. She wasn't going to let the past define her. She was going to build the future she deserved. Janet went to her computer and opened her email. She drafted a message to Michael, knowing it was time to have a direct conversation with him. She couldn't keep avoiding the truth. She couldn't keep letting him dictate the terms of their relationship. "Michael," she wrote, "I've been thinking a lot about our conversation last night. I want you to know that I'm not going to let you or anyone else make decisions about my life without my consent. This is my home, and I will fight to stay here. We need to have a serious conversation about what's best for me, not what you think is best. I won't be pushed aside any longer." Janet hit send before she could second-guess herself. The words were out there now, and there was no taking them back. She was done playing the role of the silent, submissive mother. She was done waiting for her family to wake up and realize the sacrifices she had made for them. Janet's hands shook slightly as she closed her laptop, but she didn't feel afraid. For the first time in a long while, she felt empowered. She was standing up for herself, for the woman she had been, and for the woman she was becoming. The path ahead wasn't clear, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to back down. She was going to take control of her future, no matter how hard it would be. Janet walked over to the window once more, staring out at the garden, the same garden that had been the backdrop of so many happy memories. She wasn't going to let them take this from her. She had earned every inch of this life, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. Janet turned away from the window and walked toward the door, ready to face whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, but she was ready. She was ready to stand up for herself, to make sure her voice was heard, and to take back what was rightfully hers. Janet sat in the living room, her eyes scanning the room as she gathered her thoughts. The stillness of the house was almost suffocating, but there was something different now, something that made the silence feel empowering instead of oppressive. She had spoken to her lawyer earlier in the morning, and everything was moving forward. The wheels were in motion. She had a plan, and it was starting to feel real. The email to Michael had been sent, and while she waited for his response, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that this was her moment to reclaim everything she had worked for. The phone rang, snapping her out of her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked at the caller ID. It was Michael. She hesitated for a second, then picked up the phone. "Hello," she said, keeping her voice steady, though she could feel her nerves creeping in. "Mom." Michael's voice came through, tight and uncomfortable. "We need to talk." Janet's pulse quickened, but she didn't let it show. She had been waiting for this moment, and now that it was here, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. "I agree," she said firmly. "I'm ready to talk. But understand this, Michael. This conversation is going to be different. I'm not backing down anymore. I'm not going to let you or anyone else push me around. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Janet wondered if Michael was going to hang up, avoiding the confrontation. But when he spoke again, his voice was quiet. "I know you're upset, Mom," he said. "But you need to understand that this isn't easy for any of us. Danielle and I, we're just trying to do what's best for you." Janet's grip on the phone tightened. "What's best for me?" she repeated, her voice colder now. "You think what's best for me is being pushed out of my own home? You think what's best for me is being treated like I'm a burden?" Michael's voice faltered slightly. "Mom, it's not like that. We're just trying to make sure you're taken care of, that you're not alone, that you're not overwhelmed." Janet could feel the anger rising within her, but she controlled it. She had to stay calm. "I've spent my entire life taking care of you, Michael," she said, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And now, when I need support, you're telling me I'm too much to handle. I've worked hard to make this home, to build a life here, and I won't just give it up because you and Danielle think I'm too old to live on my own." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Janet thought he was going to argue. But when he spoke again, his tone had softened. "I never meant for it to sound that way," Michael said, the apology faint but present. "I know you've done a lot for us, but I just don't know what else to do. We've been worried about you, about your health, your future." Janet's heart twisted at his words. She had always wanted the best for Michael, had always tried to protect him, even as he had grown older. But now, it felt like he was the one trying to take control of her life. "Michael," she said, her voice gentler now, "I don't need you to control my life. I need you to respect me. I need you to see me as a person, not as someone to be managed or dismissed." She could hear him take a deep breath on the other end of the line. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't realize how much I was hurting you. I never meant for things to get like this." Janet closed her eyes, the weight of everything settling over her. She had spent so much time giving, sacrificing, putting everyone else's needs before her own. But now, she was taking back her life. She wasn't going to be pushed out of the family she had worked so hard to build. "I know you didn't mean to hurt me, Michael," Janet said, her voice soft but firm. "But I won't let you take away my dignity, my independence. I won't let you make decisions for me anymore. I'm not going anywhere." There was a moment of silence, and then Michael spoke, his voice low. "What do you want me to do, Mom?" he asked, the vulnerability in his tone surprising her. Janet took a deep breath, her heart still racing. "I want you to respect my decisions," she said, her voice unwavering. "I want you to understand that I am not weak, that I am not a burden. I have lived my life on my terms, and I'm not going to let you or anyone else take that away from me." Michael didn't say anything for a long time. Janet could hear him breathing on the other end of the line, and she knew he was thinking, processing. "Okay," he said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. "I understand. I'm sorry for everything, Mom. I'll respect your decision. I just want you to be okay." Janet felt a weight lift off her shoulders. It wasn't the end, but it was a start. A small victory. "Thank you," she said, her voice softening. "I'll be okay, Michael. I'm stronger than you think." The call ended, and Janet sat in silence for a moment, the phone still pressed to her ear. The house was still quiet, but now, it didn't feel so heavy. Janet knew there was still work to be done, still battles to be fought, but she was ready. She was no longer afraid. She had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. And nothing, not even her son, was going to stop her. Janet sat on the edge of the couch, the phone resting quietly beside her, the conversation with Michael still echoing in her mind. It had gone better than she had expected. He had apologized, and for the first time in a long while, Janet felt a flicker of hope. She hadn't expected him to change overnight, but this was a start. She had stood her ground, and for once, her voice had been heard. The quiet in the house was no longer suffocating. It was the kind of silence that comes with peace, the kind that lets you reflect without the weight of worry crushing your every thought. The phone call had been a turning point, but Janet knew the real work was only beginning. She had made the first move, but now, she had to make sure she followed through. She walked to the kitchen, her steps measured and purposeful. It was time to take back control of her life, to rebuild what had been broken. Janet had always prided herself on being self-sufficient, on handling things alone when she had to. But in the last few months, the loneliness had crept in, making her feel invisible, as if her existence didn't matter. She had spent years making sure her family was taken care of, and now, It was time for her to take care of herself. Janet opened the refrigerator, her eyes scanning the shelves. She wasn't hungry, but the act of preparing something, anything, gave her a sense of normalcy, of routine. She found herself chopping vegetables for a salad, the knife slicing through the crisp produce with a rhythm that helped steady her mind. As she worked, she thought about the conversation with Michael. The guilt in his voice had been real, but Janet knew that it wasn't enough. He had been living with a certain mindset for so long, one that assumed she would always be there, always be the one to make sacrifices, always the one to support. It was hard to shake that, but Janet was determined to help him see that she was not the woman he thought she was. She was no longer the person who would simply fade into the background. She had a life to live, and she was going to live it on her terms. The salad was ready, and Janet placed it on the table, sitting down with a deep sigh. She wasn't sure what came next, but she felt a sense of peace, knowing she was no longer hiding from the truth. The phone rang again, and this time, it was Amy. Janet picked it up without hesitation. "Hey, Janet." Amy's voice was warm, comforting. "How did the conversation go with Michael?" Janet smiled softly, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. "Better than I expected," she said. "He apologized. I think he's finally starting to understand that I'm not going to just sit by and let him push me around anymore." Amy's voice softened with understanding. "I'm proud of you, Janet. You've been through so much, and now, you're standing up for yourself. That takes real strength." Janet felt her heart swell at her sister's words. "It wasn't easy, but it's time. I'm done being the one who always gives, always sacrifices. It's my turn to take control." Amy was silent for a moment, and then she spoke, her voice filled with emotion. "You deserve this, Janet. You deserve to be seen, to be heard. And I'm here for you, every step of the way." Janet's heart warmed at the support. She had always been the strong one, the one who kept things together for everyone else. But now, for the first time in a long while, she felt like she didn't have to do it all on her own. She wasn't alone anymore. "Thank you, Amy," Janet said quietly. "I don't know what I would do without you." "You're not alone, Janet. You've never been alone." Janet smiled, a real smile this time, as if something inside her had clicked into place. She had spent so many years being the one to hold everything together, but now it was time to let others help her, to let herself be supported. She wasn't a burden. She was a person with her own needs, her own dreams, and it was time to start living for herself. The conversation with Amy ended, and Janet sat quietly for a moment, reflecting on everything that had happened. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid to face it. She had stood up for herself, she had fought for her place in her family, and she wasn't going to stop now. Janet stood up, walking to the window, the soft glow of the evening sun casting long shadows across the garden. The flowers John had planted all those years ago were still blooming, still thriving, just like she would. She wasn't done yet. This was only the beginning.